All right, so today we are talking about Socrates. And before I get into the lecture, I want to tell you what the sources are that I used for this, because I think it's important that y'all know that. So we have this book, Philosophy 101, and this is by Paul Kleinman. And this is a really good, kind of overview of a bunch of different philosophical topics. There's also The 15-Minute Philosopher by Nina Rosenstand, or I'm sorry, this one is by Anne Rooney. And this is another kind of overview of philosophical topics. Then we have, this is Nina Rosenstand's The Moral of the Story. And this is a textbook, actually. And my newest addition to my kind of Socrates knowledge is this book, The Hemlock Cup by Bettany Hughes. She's a historian and a writer, and she does a great job of really painting the picture for you of what the world was like around Socrates. So it's called The Hemlock Cup, Socrates, Athens, and the Search for the Good Life. So if you are a history and philosophy fan, check this one out. I'm slowly making my way through it. So I'm sure that when I do this next semester, I'll have even more information from it, but I have some good stuff that I've pulled from it for our discussion of Socrates. So I do have resources posted for y'all. If you look on the Canvas site and you go under the modules and you look at the module that's called Socrates, you'll see there's a set of notes that's titled Introduction to Socrates. There's also a set of passages about Socrates from this book, The Hemlock Cup. Then there's an article that's entitled Unthinkable, Was Socrates Right About the Unexamined Life? And we'll talk about that quote of his about the unexamined life in just a couple of minutes. For those of you who prefer to have the audio visual experience with some videos, there's one from Wireless Philosophy called The Examined Life, Know Thyself. And then there's another video called The Ideas of Socrates. So between those resources, we should be able to get a pretty good little introduction to this man who is known as the father of Western philosophy. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll talk about the different passages that I pulled from these books, and then I'll give you kind of my little spiel about Socrates. So as far as looking at specific dates, Socrates was alive from 469 to 399 BC. He was born in Athens, Greece, around 469 BC, and we know that he died in 399 BC. So the pre-Socratic philosophers are these philosophers who essentially came before him. Some were alive during his time, but they were dealing mostly with examining the natural world. Socrates was one of the first philosophers to place emphasis on the human experience within the world. So he was focusing on individual morality. He questioned what it was that made a good life, and he discussed social and political questions. So his work and his ideas became the foundations of Western philosophy. So much of what we think and the way that we think came from Socrates and came from those ideas. So this is from Philosophy 101. While Socrates is widely regarded as one of the wisest men to have ever lived, he never wrote down any of his thoughts. And all that we know about him is based on the written works of his students and contemporaries. And this is mainly the works of Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. So as the author goes on to say, because everything we know about Socrates is based on accounts from others where events were often fictionalized, and because these accounts differ, we don't actually know that much about him or his teachings. And this issue is known as the Socratic problem. So when you hear somebody talking about the Socratic problem, what they're talking about is the fact that Socrates himself never wrote anything down. Everything that we think that we know about him comes from other people. It comes from other sources. And what you'll find if you look at the works of Plato versus the works of Xenophon versus the works of Aristophanes is you'll see different versions of Socrates. So one of the things that you saw earlier in the semester was in the introduction to philosophy, the two first philosophical schools that we know of in ancient Greece were Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. Well, Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. We'll talk much more about Aristotle next week. Okay, so because everything that we think that we know about Socrates is based on the ideas of other people, what we have to do is we kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt, right? And that's one of the things that we're doing in this class is we're questioning the information that we have. And we need to think about it in a way to where we're analyzing it, where we're thinking about it critically. We don't just take everything at face value that everyone says. And why do we do that? We do that because of Socrates. We do it because that's what he was teaching people in Athens to do, specifically younger people. He was teaching them to question everything. So this idea that philosophy is questioning everything and that we're engaging in this critical thinking, that all comes from Socrates. So what do we think we know about Socrates? We think that he was the son of a stonemason and a midwife. He most likely had a basic Greek education. He was not aesthetically good looking. He was not an attractive man. And this is during a time when external beauty was very important. So in the same way that now we have a very materialistic society that is really focused on external beauty, that's how it was in ancient Athens when Socrates was alive. So being this pretty unattractive man in that society is one thing that would cause people not to like you. And of course, that sounds, kind of ridiculous and, like I said, materialistic, but that's what the society was. And we still do that to people in our society. Anyway, here's a picture of Socrates. I hope y'all are getting to see that. This is from the Hemlock Cup, just so you can see what he looked like. He was a kind of a stout, squatty man. He did not care about what he looked like, and so he would just walk around like in the same tattered, dirty clothes, like not worrying about wearing shoes, anything like that. Did not care at all what he looked like or what people thought about what he looked like. We do know that Socrates served in the military during the Peloponnesian War. He was known as a great warrior for the city-state of Athens. He had 3 sons with a much younger woman who, according to some of these written works that talk about Socrates, say that she was kind of always on him because he lived in poverty. He had no ambition to make money or to find some kind of status and acclaim that was the popular way of life in Athens. So people wanted to be famous and they wanted to be politicians so they could have power. Socrates wasn't trying to do any of that. He did not care at all about those things. And that is something that we find that's very different about him. And that's one of the things that we must keep like in the back of our minds when we talk about Socrates, is what he thought was important and what he thought was not important about living a good human life. So the one detail about Socrates' life that is very well documented and that is incredibly famous is his death. Something that needs to be kept in mind when we talk about what happened to Socrates and how he ended up being killed at the orders of the city-state of Athens is you've got to keep in mind the political situation at the time. So what they point out, what Paul Kleinman points out in Philosophy 101 is that while Socrates was alive, the city-state of Athens began to decline. So in ancient Greece, I don't know, y'all probably have learned this in the past. Some of you might have forgotten it, but there were all of these city-states. It wasn't one country that was united under one political system or one set of political leaders. So Athens was a city-state, Sparta was a city-state. You had these different city-states, and there were wars between these different city-states. So having lost to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, the city-state of Athens was going through what they called an identity crisis of sorts in this book. And what Kleinman talks about is he says that Athens became fixated on physical beauty, ideas of wealth, and romanticizing the past. Physical beauty, ideas of wealth, and romanticizing the past. And because Socrates was an outspoken critic of that way of life, of fixating on, beauty, on wealth, he didn't think beauty or wealth were important. Because Socrates was a critic of that way of life, a lot of people began to see him as an enemy. So, in addition to that, what Socrates was doing was he was telling this younger generation of young men who would eventually be the people who were going to lead the city-state of Athens. So these are the sons of the powerful men of Athens. And yes, I'm saying men because ancient Athenian society was very sexist. Women were essentially treated like children. They were not involved in any of this. So you couldn't be a citizen if you were a woman. A citizen in the city-state of Athens had to be a free man of certain classes who met certain specific ranks. So we're talking about the people who were running everything were these men. So that's just the fact of the history of it. So what ends up happening is Socrates is teaching these young men about these different sorts of ideas that are in contrast to the ideas that are being taught to them by their fathers and by the system at the time and by the religious leaders. Socrates is teaching these young men to question everything. So he's teaching them to question the religious leaders. He's teaching them to question the city's political leaders. And he's causing problems for those who are in power by doing this. So in 399 BC, Socrates was arrested and he was brought to trial on 2 capital offenses. Now, a capital offense is an offense for which you can be put to death. So the first offense that he was brought up on, the first charge, was that he was engaging in heresy. He was being like anti-religious. And the other thing was that he was allegedly corrupting the city's youth. So what I'm doing right now, teaching y'all to question everything, teaching you critical thinking, this is what Socrates was doing. And this was considered corrupting the youth of Athens. So Socrates is brought up on trial on these 2 charges. And one thing that I want y'all to keep in mind about this whole system is that in ancient Greece, they had a very different way of doing trials. They had a different sort of criminal justice system. So in our criminal justice system in the United States, if someone is brought to trial on criminal charges, those must be by an indictment or an information, which is an official charging document. And those documents are brought by the state on behalf of the people of the state, right? So it's the state that's going to be doing the trial, right? They're the ones who are trying the person. You have the state versus the defense. Now, in the ancient city-state of Athens, it was private citizens against Socrates. The laws allowed private citizens to sue other people in criminal court. So it's a very big difference. Also, with our trials, if someone is found guilty, it must be a unanimous verdict in the vast majority of the states. There are some very minimal exceptions that we're not going to get into because this isn't a law class, but if you have questions about that, you can send me an email and I'll let you know about that. But the most of the jurisdictions in the United States, in order for a person to be found guilty of a criminal offense, the jury has to be unanimous in that verdict of guilty, okay? That's not the case in the ancient city-state of Athens. There, all you needed was a bare majority. So Socrates ends up going on trial, and he goes in, and it's really interesting if you read Plato's Apology, because that shows that part of Socrates' life where he is on trial. And we'll talk about that later in the semester when we talk about social contract theory and contractarianism. We'll talk about the Apology, and we'll talk about Plato's Crito, where these both deal with what happened with Socrates at the time. So essentially what happens is Socrates knows that they're setting up pretty much a political assassination of him, because he knows it's going to be a guilty verdict. He knows he's going to get the death penalty. He knows how this is all going to work out, but he's not afraid. And that's one of the things that he's famous for saying, is that death is either a peaceful slumber or something better. He may or may not have said that. We like the idea that he said that. Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, but it goes along with kind of the theme as how he conducted himself throughout the trial and through all of this. So Socrates goes on trial for these offenses. He is prosecuted by the private citizens who say that he should be found guilty for this. And there's a two-part trial, which is like what we have now. It's called a bifurcated system. You have the first phase, which is the guilt innocence phase. If you're found guilty, you move on to the punishment phase. So Socrates is found guilty. Again, we'll talk about that in detail later in the semester. He's found guilty during that first guilt innocence phase of the trial. And then they move on to the punishment phase. And during the punishment phase of his trial, both sides are supposed to propose a punishment. And the punishment that the people who brought these charges, the opposition, bring is they say, you should be put to death. And they expect that Socrates will ask to go live in exile, right? And he does not do that. What Socrates says is that he should be punished by being rewarded like he's an Olympian. And Olympians were super important. They got free food and housing and all this great stuff if you were a winner of the Olympics. It was a huge deal. Like the way we treat celebrities now, times 10. And so this was kind of done in a way to ensure that they would have to put him to death. That's the theory, is that Socrates was trying to goad them into it, because he didn't want them to get away with essentially bringing up these charges and just making him shut his mouth. And that's what he saw it would be if he was to just leave, or if he was to stop practicing philosophy. It would just shut him up, and that wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was to find truth, and he wanted people to continue to try to find truth and to question the world around them so that they could find truth. So this is what ends up making Socrates a martyr for philosophy. In fact, he was offered the opportunity to not have these charges brought against him if he would just stop practicing philosophy, and he said that he wouldn't do that. So when he has this proposal for the jury that they reward him for, being found guilty of these two capital offenses, it like takes off the jury. Socrates is poking the bear, and he's doing this on purpose because he's going to make them kill him. He's a smart man. And I think that Socrates sees things that will happen in the future. He sees how big of a deal his death will become. He understands that the way that the world is changing at the time, and partially due to philosophy, is that people want more information. The knowledge of what happened to him will spread, and it does, and that's what ends up happening. So Socrates is found guilty. He's sentenced to death, and the way that he is supposed to be put to death is by drinking hemlock, which is a poison, and it's a really, really painful death. So Socrates is found guilty. He's given his sentence, and there's a little bit of time between the time his sentence is handed down and the time that it's to be carried out, because there were these religious festivals that were going on, and it was illegal to carry out a death sentence during those festivals because they were worried about how the gods would react and all that kind of stuff. So during that time, some of Socrates' students and his followers come up with this plan so that they can get Socrates out, that he can escape. And they come to him in prison, because prison was not the same as it is in the United States. Like at that point in time, people could bring you food, they could bring you blankets, they could help you, essentially you needed somebody to pay for you to be in prison and to make sure that you were fed and like kept alive. And so they bribed some of the guards, and they got in, and they tell Socrates, hey, we have a way of getting you out of here. Come, let's escape. Don't drink your hemlock. And we'll talk about this again when we talk about social contract theory. But I'll tell you the reasons why Socrates says that he should not ethically do that, and why he will not do that. And what he ends up doing is he ends up drinking the hemlock, and he dies. And like I said, I think that he knew what was going to happen. I think that he knew that he would be seen as a martyr. And I think that he knew that this story would spread. And as you see, 2,500 years later, we are still talking about Socrates, and we're still talking about his influence on philosophy, and the fact that he was this person who would die for the sake of finding the truth. So let's talk a little bit more about that influence and what Socrates thought. So as far as his contributions to philosophy, one of the things that is most famous is probably the Socratic method. So with the Socratic method, this is originally described in Plato's Socratic dialogues. You see that Socrates and a pupil will have a discussion on a particular issue, and through a series of questions, Socrates sets out to discover the driving force behind how that individual's beliefs and sentiments were shaped, and in that process, get closer to the truth. So by continuously asking questions, Socrates is able to expose contradictions in the way an individual thinks, and that allows you to see those contradictions and to fix that way of thinking and to come to a solid conclusion about something. Excuse me. So the Socratic method is still used widely in education, most notably in law schools in the United States. And I did this. Actually, 1 year in law school, I had to explain negligence. So I spent 45 minutes standing up doing the Socratic method with my professor. It was actually my birthday that day too. So that was rough, I'll tell you what. But I made it through it, and y'all can too. So here's what happens is first a student is asked to summarize a judge's argument. Then the student's asked if they agree with the judge's argument. And then the professor acts as the devil's advocate. They ask all these different questions to make the student defend their decision and defend what they had to say. And it's by using the Socratic method that students are able to start thinking critically, using logic and reasoning to create arguments, and while also finding different holes and like patching up holes in their different positions. So when we're talking about critical thinking, and we're talking about thinking about our biases and about what knowledge we have when we come to a topic and what sources we have, when we're thinking about whether an argument is logically valid, or if there are any fallacies in the argument, that's all stuff that can be drawn out through the Socratic method. It just can be a little bit harrowing when you're standing up in front of a whole class having to do that. So I think that there are some law schools that are kind of shying away from it, but at St. Mary's, they definitely do that. All right, so some more about Socrates. Why should we study Socrates, and why is he so important to us? Probably the most famous quote that we have from Socrates is this quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." So if you look at the Hemlock Cup, it says, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being." And that's important. There's this specific necessity that we know that Socrates is talking about a human being. So when we talk about this idea of the unexamined life not being worth living, again, remember, we don't have his writings. We don't have his words to tell us what Socrates was thinking. But what we think he thought is that Socrates believed that in order for a person to be wise, that individual must be able to understand themselves. So for Socrates, an individual's actions were directly related to their intelligence and to their ignorance. Socrates believed that people should develop themselves instead of concentrating on material objects. So he sought to understand the difference between acting good and actually being good. And it's in this way that he approached knowledge, consciousness, and morality that Socrates forever changed the future of philosophy. So when we think about Socrates and why he's so important, the author of the Hemlock Cup, Bettany Hughes, says, "We think the way we do because Socrates thought the way he did." Socrates' belief that as individuals we need to question the world around us stands at the heart of what it means to live in modern times. In the Socratic dialogues generated 24 centuries ago, we find the birth of ethos, ethics, and the identification of the psyche. The first martyr, in Greek, martyrs means witness, a witness to truth, virtue, and justice, and freedom of speech, is commemorated as a bedrock of our civilization. And she goes on and she says, "Socrates stands at the beginning of our world, when democracy and liberty are first conceived as fundamental values of society. We need to understand him because he did not just pursue the meaning of life, but the meaning of our own lives." She goes on to say, "Socrates sees us coming. He worries that the pursuit of plenty will bring about mindless materialism, that democracy will become just a banner under which to fight. What is the point, he says, of warships and city walls and glittering statues if we are not happy? If we have lost sight of what is good? His is a question that is more pertinent now than ever. He asks, what is the right way to live? And I think that she like hits the nail on the head with all of that. And that's one of the things that I think stands out so well when we think about Socrates and we think about what he was talking about is it's a timeless way of looking at the world, like looking at the world around you and its influence on you versus the way that we want to act if we are to be virtuous people, right? So when we go on and we talk about virtue ethics later in the semester, we're going to see that that has its roots in Socrates. We'll focus mostly on Aristotelian virtue ethics, but remember, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. So it comes from Socrates when we talk about what it means to live a good and virtuous life. So let's see, there were some other things that I wanted to share with y'all about this. I think I wanted to give you kind of a better idea of what it was like to see this man, because he got seriously, like he would just hang out in like his tattered, what are they, it's not, I don't think they called it a toga in ancient Greece, but it was the equivalent of like a toga. So he's standing there just like hanging out in this thing. It's all dirty, it's all gross. There was a story that one day he stood in the same spot all day. And somebody came up to him and like, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm just thinking. All day, same spot, didn't move, just thinking. I just think that's so interesting. I think he must have been a really, really strange person to a lot of the people in ancient Greece. I mean, imagine if we had somebody like this, who's just kind of there, doesn't care about anything. We see those people who don't seem to care. They live in their own little world. It doesn't matter what's going on around them. And I admire a lot of people like that because I think they kind of live in a way that's a bit more close to what it means for them to be virtuous. I think that Socrates was right, that we do have this society that's built a lot on materialism, but that doesn't mean that we can't change that. So what Socrates wants us to do is he wants us to question everything. So Socrates often said that the only thing that he was sure about was his own ignorance, and that if he was wiser than other men, it was in that he recognized his own ignorance. Socrates made this habit of challenging people who thought themselves to be knowledgeable to define certain common concepts such as justice or courage. And then he would present these counter arguments to reveal those inconsistencies and contradictions in what they had to say. And it didn't matter how they answered, he could always pick holes in what they said. So what Socrates was trying to show was that everything is much more complicated than we are inclined to think, and accepting commonly held beliefs without scrutiny is an unwise thing to do. So he really did just want us to question everything, and that's because he wanted us to gain this wisdom for ourselves. And that's because Socrates thought that if you didn't know yourself, you would never be able to truly know anything. So knowing yourself and examining your life are incredibly important things. What I said earlier was that this is specific to humans. And again, we don't know exactly what he was thinking, but if y'all look at the article that's listed, what is it called? I keep forgetting the name of it. Unthinkable, Was Socrates Right About the Unexamined Life? In that article, they go through and they try to kind of guess what he was talking about at the time. And what we have to do is we have to think about what it means to be a human being and how at the time Socrates was alive, they viewed human beings as separate and distinct from other types of animals, because humans are animals. So this goes back to the idea that humans are the rational animal, like that we have the ability to think about these ideas. We have the ability to consider these things. And that because we have the ability to engage in reason and rationality and to question things about the world around us, that we should do so, that it's kind of like an obligation that we have. because we have that ability. So what Socrates wants us to do is he wants us to forget about the noise of the society around us, forget about the values that we see in social media or whatever media, forget about money, forget about what we look like, forget about all of that, and focus on what it means to truly be good and truly be virtuous. He thought that wealth and popularity and all of that is not really worth anything. He thought intrinsic value was in love and in virtue. And so that's kind of like Socrates' ideas in a nutshell. I know that this was kind of heavy on like the historical end of things, but like I said, later in the semester, we'll have a day where we talk about the philosophical arguments that he sets forth in Plato's Apology and in the Crito, so that you can see those arguments set forth for social contract theory and what he thought he owed as far as his obligations to the city-state of Athens. So let's see, was there anything else? I could talk about Socrates all day. I love him. I think he's great. I really appreciate just that mental picture of him just kind of hanging out, not caring what people think, asking people questions all day long. And that's one thing that they point out in all of these different books is one of the really interesting things about Socrates, and kind of I think where the questioning comes, philosophy always asking questions and being fine with that, is they talk about how in most instances we want to get to answers and we want to get them fast, right? And Socrates was fine just asking questions, and that's what we still see with philosophers today. But the reason that we ask those questions is because we learn by asking those questions, not just by answering them, but by also asking them. Okay, well, that is it for this recording. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and say bye to the people who are watching the recording. Y'all have a good day.